I'm Tom Schelling. I think I'm last in this series because I'm the oldest, and I'm going to talk about what is the oldest story in game theory. It has the esoteric name of The Prisoner's Dilemma. It is the most read, the most discussed, the most written about story in all of game theory. It was originally unpublished, but I think it has a record for being republished more than anything else ever written in game theory.
Well, a very warm welcome to this last lecture in the Darwin College lecture series on games. As she told us last week, the master is in the United States at the moment, and so I'm being her deputy. It is, of course, very appropriate that the last lecture in this series should be given by one of the founding fathers of game theory, Professor Thomas Schelling. He was trained at Berkeley and Harvard. He cut his teeth working as a young economist on the introduction of the Marshall Plan, which anyone with a sense of history will know is something for which Western Europe should feel deeply indebted. Partly as a result of this experience, Professor Schelling's interests shifted from economics towards game theory. His book, The Strategy of Conflict, published in 1960, had a seminal impact on the development of the subject. It draws on a very wide range of examples from the everyday to the exotic. It developed a very rigorous analysis of the way people in practice cope with the extraordinary conflict which is endemic to all societies. And in particular, it explored the ways in which people with overlapping interests can, if they're so minded, build cooperation. What I found and what I find particularly impressive is the way that Professor Schelling has subsequently extended this work over a long career at Yale and Harvard and Maryland to shed light on a very wide range of issues. For example, how is economic monopoly power used and collusion used in the economy? For example, and very different, how is it that we as individuals choose to present ourselves to society? For example, by what processes do societies, for better and for worse, come to define us in categories which they then take seriously? For example, what is the nature of and what are the uses of nuclear deterrence? And the thing he's been working on for many years, what are the politics of mitigating global climate change? Of many distinctions that Professor Schelling has had, he shared in 2005 the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for, and I quote, having enhanced our understanding of conflict and cooperation through games theory analysis. If I could end on a personal note, over 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, I was browsing in Blackwell's bookshop, the way one does, and I stumbled across this book, The Strategy of Conflict, just out in paperback. Now, having come myself from economics to economics from a background in mathematics, but with something close to an obsession with politics, I just couldn't put it down. I was fascinated by the range and real life nature of the examples. I was fascinated by the power of the logic it used in explaining such varied bargaining behavior. I didn't know then that my future career was going to be oriented around labor relations and industrial arbitration, but it must have done me some good. And I see it cost 11 shillings and sixpence. So as impulse buys go, it wasn't a bad one. But that makes me all the more in awe of the honour of introducing Professor Schelling, who is to speak about the game theory of conflict. Professor Schelling.
Thank you. I rarely get to speak to such a large audience with every seat filled. And I think the reason I'm the last speaker in this lecture series is that I am undoubtedly very much the oldest of all the speakers. So it's a distinguished position to be final. My introduction made it sound a little as though I'm sort of a mathematician. I have to tell you a story. My wife and I visited Iran 10 years ago. I went to the Sharif University of Technology in Tehran, and they offered me an honorary degree. When I got there, they had discovered that their university, which had a Department of Economics, hadn't yet awarded its first PhD. And according to university rules, they couldn't offer an honorary degree if they hadn't yet awarded a PhD. So the economics department threw up its hands, but the university people decided they'd shipped me all the way to Tehran from the United States. So they went around to the mathematics department and said, you know, this guy was awarded a Nobel Prize for game theory, and you know what game theory is, don't you? And they all said, yeah, we've heard of it. And the answer was, couldn't you award him an honorary PhD in mathematics? They said, happy to oblige. So I am actually an honorary doctor of mathematics. And that's my credentials. And what I'm going to talk about is the most famous, the most reproduced, the most acknowledged, the most taught about story in the history of game theory. Some of you may have heard of it. It's usually called the prisoner's dilemma. This is from unpublished notes by a man named Albert Tucker, who was spending some time at Stanford University. And the whole thing is so brief, I can read it to you in less than 2 minutes. Two men charged with a joint violation of law are held separately by the police. Each is told that if one confesses and the other does not, the former will be given a reward of 1 unit and the latter will be fined 2 units. If both confess, each will be fined 1 unit. At the same time, each has good reason to believe that if neither confesses, both will go clear. That's it. That's all there is. And this is the most republished thing in the history of game theory, and yet it was never published by its original author. And I don't think he spent much time over it. All he wanted to do was demonstrate that there are situations, very often, but not always two-party situations in which the best choice for each turns out to be not the best choice for the two taken together. Now, this is commonly understood in dealing with multi-party game situations. I think right now almost everybody who deals with climate change talks about how collectively agreeing to do something about climate change is by far and away the best thing to do compared with doing nothing, But it's also, it would be in the individual interest of any nation to sit still, forget about climate change, and let all the other nations do the job for them. And this is, I think that is now widely recognized. It shows up in arms control negotiations and climate negotiations and tariff negotiations and so forth. But I think it's not easy to find this situation with two parties dealing with each other, or dealing with a situation in which each has a choice, and the best choice for each is not the best choice for the two together. And I'm going to walk us through this examination in a way that the author, Albert Tucker was his name, the author, I think, did not. And when I look around to find two-person situations that are like this, I find them difficult to find. And I think that's because they have been so common for so many thousands of years that solutions have been found. There's the problem, how can I borrow some money from one of you? And how can I prove that I will pay it back? Well, I think that's a problem in a society that hasn't the institutions that permit people to borrow money. The invention of the pawn shop is a good example. If I have a musical instrument, I can take it to a pawn shop, leave it there, and borrow an amount of money that may be up to a third of the value of the clarinet, knowing that if I don't pay back the loan with interest on time, they will sell the clarinet and keep the proceeds. And banks have learned how to lend money with the privilege of suing you for return. And question, if I try to order something by telephone or by mail, and they want money in advance, do I trust them to ship me what I've paid for? Or if they ship it first, do they trust me to pay them for it? These problems really, for most of us, don't any longer exist because we found ways to take care of them. But this is the one that intrigues me, partly because Albert Tucker didn't work out the analysis at all. And as I have tried with students to work out the analysis, I find that it takes more than an hour, which is all I have here, to work it through with some care. But see, this is a situation in which if I'm one of the parties charged with a joint violation of the law, one of the two, if I expect you to confess, then I have to confess, because if I don't, I will get fined doubly. If I expect you not to confess, then I gain by confessing because I collect a reward. And I think it goes without saying in the original version that confession is jointly confession for oneself and incrimination of the partner. So that all it takes is one confession to get us both declared guilty. And if he doesn't confess, I confess he is found guilty and is fined doubly. And therefore, it's in his interest, whatever he expects me to do, to confess. And it's in my interest, whatever I expect him to do, to confess. And yet, at the same time, each has good reason to believe that if neither confesses, both will go free. That's why it's usually called the dilemma, and I think dilemma is the wrong word In my dictionary, a dilemma is any choice between two equally offensive outcomes. And this is a case in which, to each of us, the two outcomes are not equally the same, except as a result of our collective decisions. Now, what we don't know, so many things, I'll list a few of them. The only thing we know about these two people is that in the original language, two men, we know their gender. They're not husband and wife. They could be father and son, brothers. They could be members of a fraternity together. They could be members of the same church. They could be members of a well-integrated, isolated immigrant group. Any kind of connection between the two of them might mean that they can both recognize that they can trust each other not to confess. The easiest thing, if my brother and I are jointly arrested and we expect if neither confesses, we'll go free. But if one confesses, the other had better confess also. So we don't know whether these people know each other, because part of what Tucker said was, it also follows that if the two could reach a binding agreement, they would readily agree, obviously agree, not to confess, but they being separated, that result is not available. If they weren't separated, they could always agree on something and shake hands. They wouldn't necessarily then trust each other, unless the two of us are brothers, or father and son, or something of the sort. On the other hand, I think it is very likely that if two people knew each other well enough to be arrested together and charged with having pulled off a successful heist of some sort, they may be intimate enough with each other that they don't need an enforceable agreement. They can just agree. They could shake hands on it. Let's not confess, neither of us. Then we'll go free. Now, the police kept them separate, so they can't get together and say, let's agree not to confess. On the other hand, if these people, two men, clearly trust each other, they don't need to sign an agreement. They don't even have to shake hands together. They can just both understand, we both know that we're both better off together if neither confesses. They may be Boy Scouts. The Scout oath is, on my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and to obey the Scout law. What is the Scout law? The Scout law is 12 commandments. The first of which is a Scout is trustworthy, and the second is a Scout is loyal. If these people are trustworthy and loyal, they don't have to say Scout's honor. They can just recognize, we know each other, we're both Boy Scouts. We wouldn't snitch on each other just to collect the double reward. So I think it is not obvious that merely by being separated, they are in no position to make a binding agreement, because there are many ways to bind an agreement. It's hard to do if we reach an agreement in Paris about reducing carbon dioxide emissions over the next 50 years. Usually binding agreement refers to an enforceable agreement. But I think two people could arrive at a, quote, binding agreement. That is an agreement that each intends not to violate. So that I think we don't have to necessarily assume that these people couldn't arrive without consulting each other at an understanding that constitutes an agreement that is binding on them. But then, one question is, can I trust the police who promised me, if you don't confess and I do, I will get a reward? An interesting question is, if we're kept separate from each other, are we allowed lawyers? If we're allowed either one lawyer who represents both of us, or two lawyers who can consult each other, they can be our ambassadors, our negotiators, and they can find ways to, by which to commit each of us to cooperation. On the other hand, it might occur to the lawyers that if they can get a signed document that says what I read to you, namely, if one confesses and the other does not, we will reward the confessor and double the fine on the one who didn't confess. Can they get that in writing, signed by the head of the police or whoever's going to be dealing with them? If they get a signed document, now the question arises, who determines their guilt, and if so, the penalty? A judge or a jury? Let's say a judge will have the authority to make the final decision. Confessions have to go before the judge, who then declares who's guilty and what the penalty should be. But if they take this signed document to a judge, they can say, I think the prosecutor is guilty of two very heinous crimes. One is bribery and the other is extortion. I suggest you put him in the blink instead of either of us. So I don't think he dares to sign his name to the fact that he is using a threat of double fines. It may be an empty threat anyway, because he may not have the authority to double the fine on somebody who refuses to confess. But anyway, I think he'd be reluctant to put it in writing, and if the lawyer attempts to get his signature and he refuses, the lawyer then may have good reason to think, this is not an enforceable promise. He promised my client a double reward if he will confess, and the other guy doesn't. And that's not a promise he can make. He doesn't control the funds. He doesn't have any authority to promise a double-sized reward. I think it's interesting to keep in mind that this is not an ordinary confession, because they're charged with essentially cooperating on the same crime. It's one crime that they jointly committed. And rather than calling it a confession, calling it an incrimination of the partner would make sense. I think it also makes sense if I have no relationship with the other one, but my confession sends me away with money and commits him to twice the ordinary prison term or twice the monetary fine. If we have any relation to each other, if we live in the same neighborhood, or if our children go to the same school, people are going to find out that I snitched on him. I got him fined doubly by confessing to a crime of which we were equally equal. But I'm not being punished. I'm being rewarded with cash. I may become very unpopular. If, as I said, we belong to the same church, or we live in the same neighborhood, or our children go to the same school, my kids will always be known to have a father who is what they call a snitch. So I think there's plenty of reason why, if I'm one of the two, I'm reluctant to confess. Question arises, do I have any way of knowing whether he confessed? If he did, I've got to confess, or I'm going to get fined doubly. If he didn't confess, then I have an interesting choice. Do I, to receive a bribe, send him off to paying a double fine? And what will his children think of my children if I do that? Question arises, and this I think might make a difference. Is this going to be a judge who decides or a jury? It doesn't sound as if a jury is going to be involved, but we don't really know. What we don't really know is whether the prosecutor is in any way authorized to make promises involving the size of the fine or the kind of reward that may be available. Now, I don't know whether Albert Tucker, when he wrote up this little story, had thought it through quite the way my students have thought it through, usually with my encouragement, because there are a lot of assumptions here. One is it's a money fine, it's not a term in jail. It's very hard to think of the opposite of if the ordinary penalty is 30 days in jail, and if I'm going to get a reward equivalent to twice the opposite of the fine, how do they give me 60 days not in jail? What's the equivalent? It has to be a monetary fine. And probably in most jurisdictions, it may not even be the case that a judge can automatically draw on the resources of the Treasury to pay the snitch a double fine. It's come question whether any of this taken to a judge would make sense, would be upheld. Neither releasing the snitch nor doubling the fine for the one who doesn't confess. It raises the question, who wants the confession in the first place? What's the confession for? Ordinarily, a confession is used to present it to the decision process, either a judge or a jury, and then they will decide, having heard the confession, whether somebody's guilty. And usually they decide, mostly the judge, but sometimes the jury itself will decide what is the appropriate penalty. It sounds as if the police in this case really want the confession, not a finding of guilt. Because paying a bribe to get a confession, if you're not going to be able to use the confession, it just sounds as if you're collecting confessions that may give you bragging rights in the police department for having got confessions, having been smart enough to induce confession by this combination of bribery and extortion. But otherwise, confessions usually are taken to a judge or jury who then decide guilty or not guilty, and maybe decide on the penalty. And what do the police get if they buy my confession with money, double your fine, and go to the judge and say, look, we got a confession. It'll only cost so and so much money. And we're going to double the fine on the other person. But we double that fine and we pay this guy a reward. We're ahead financially, but not very far ahead, because if we pay a reward that uses up half the double fine, we didn't get much for our money. So what is the advantage here? I think, in a way, this was though it is now the most popular episode in all game theory, the most familiar little story. It's probably one of the first things discussed in any classroom on the theory of games. But I think it invites a lot of examination here, and I think that when Tucker wrote this in 1950, 65 years ago, 6 years after the publication of the original theory of games and economic behavior, almost nobody knew what game theory was at that time. He was a pioneer in making this up. And I think anybody who has ever studied game theory has heard of this as a prisoner's dilemma. It'll probably last for another 60 years. And aside from this not being a dilemma, it is not as self-evident as it was intended to be, that there's no way that these two people can reach a tacit understanding about no confessions and abide by it. Incidentally, we are not going to have a question and answer session, but if anybody would like to ask me any question, including for references to some of this, I'll give you 1 minute to get out a pencil and paper, and I'll give you my email address. I don't see anybody getting out pencil and paper. Oh, somebody did. All right. My email address is TSCHELLI. That's simply T Schelling without the final NG. TSCHELLI at umd.edu. And I don't know where you come from, but if you email me from there, I'll promise you an answer.
Can we hold you to that?
Scout's honor. Well, that's my pitch, and I wish we had space for questions, but I've enjoyed this, and I hope you have too. And I think I'm early. Am I early, Alice? Yeah. But I've enjoyed it. And so thank you.
Well, so much for the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know whether it'll be putting a lot of lecturers out of jobs, but it might make them think hard about how they write their first lecture. One of the things I got from your book, Professor Schelling, was the richness of the fact that actually the context is everything. And without the context, it's very hard to know how people play a simple game. And since most of human life consists of what we may not call them such, but consists of interactive games, everything lies in the context. I do think that the issue of how one develops games, which has been a theme in this lecture series, will clearly develop and develop. And at a time when the world becomes ever more open to truly international threats, which require international responses, I think it's a source of concern to everyone, certainly in Europe, and certainly currently in the United States, if your primaries are anything to go by. That politics in the Western world appears to be becoming ever more parochial. Professor Schelling's work has shown powerfully the importance of rational and dispassionate analysis if we're to solve these problems. I'm sure you'll join with me in thanking Professor Schelling for talking to us, and thank you very much. Can I just, it leaves to me to thank various people for this series. David Blagden and Mark Durand have organised the series and put it together. Richard and Anne King have made the whole series possible, the have successive series. And finally, there's the Darwin College team who just make these things run, which is really rather impressive. However, next year is another year, if I can get this to work. 2017, same time, same place, don't be late. Thank you very much.